President Chin, we're ready to begin.
Thank you. And as I just lost the agenda. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Saturday. What is it? March 6th. Sorry, I just had the agenda up and now it's gone. We are starting our special study session today. And our first order of business, I believe, is roll call.
Flag salute.
Flag salute. Thank you. I'm sorry. It just disappeared.
No problem.
Here it is. If everyone would repeat after me. Ready? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice
for all.
Thank you. Next is roll call. Trustee Corzo.
Here.
Trustee Proctor.
Here.
Trustee Warren.
Here.
Trustee Watkins.
Here.
And I am here as well. Approval of today's agenda. We have our governance agenda. Does anyone want to make a motion, or if there are any changes, please let us know.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Thank you, Trustee Proctor. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Trustee Warren. Roll call vote. Trustee Corzo.
Yes.
Trustee Proctor.
Yes.
Trustee Warren.
Yes.
And Trustee Watkins.
Yes.
And I will vote yes as well. So the agenda is set. We have, let's see, we don't have a translator yet, so we won't make that announcement. So we'll go to public comments.
President Chin, I'm working on the translator. She needs to have a new link.
Okay.
So I'll just be one moment, but I can go forward with public comment.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we start with public comments? So this is public statements. This is a special study session. So basically public statements related to anything on the agenda is all taken now, and we'll limit public comment to 3 minutes, please.
If anyone would like to make a comment to the board on this agenda topic, please raise your hand at this time. President Chin, we have one raised hand. Randy, would you like, you said 3 minutes, right?
Please, yes, thank you.
Randy, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for taking this time to work on your governance for an extra 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon, among the many hours that you already spend in service as trustees. I'm confident that a couple of you sought out and took on this responsibility solely out of interest for our community's public schools and children, and have no interest in using this position as a stepping stone to other public office. I appreciate that pure intent, and I recognize the work and responsibility involved either way. I read through your handbook in advance of today's session, and there's some points that stand out to me as a parent, a community member, and a voter who does pay attention. On page 5, it says, school board trustees are the representatives of the people, elected to ensure the district schools educate the children in consideration of the interests of the local community. The role of the school board is to govern the district. To me, this doesn't mean that the school board runs the operations of the district. The superintendent does that. The school board doesn't represent the district. The school board represents the people. Your role is to govern or to direct or to oversee. You have the authority to hold the superintendent accountable. You are not the chief gratitude officers. You are not the chief communications officers. However, to be honest, in board meetings, it frequently doesn't appear that you as a board understand completely this role. You ask for things, but you don't follow up. So there's not accountability. You ask for permission from the superintendent, and you take a lot of direction from the superintendent instead of the other way around. There's a lot of time spent on exuberant praise for people just doing the things that they're paid to do, their jobs. There's time taken not to discuss business, but to rather explain the things for the benefit of the public. I don't believe that this is the place or time, and this is not your job. There have been things pulled from the consent agenda simply to highlight your own accomplishments, not for any meaningful discussion. There's not always a respectful or professional demeanor, with the board president spending the majority of his time rambling, and then at times threatening to shorten public comment time and interrupting commenters before their time is up. While most board members consistently put the needs of students first as part of their comments, the current board president rarely does. The students he mentions are usually his own. Finally, there have been times when there have been rambling circular discussions with many ideas thrown out, and the superintendent says, "Thank you, I have my direction," without stating the direction or the action. The public is left wondering what was directed. And I wonder whether the entire exercise is to say as many things as possible so that the superintendent can choose what she would like to pursue as the direction. You all have been elected to represent the people. We need you now more than ever to do that. While you're wearing your board member hats, you need to put your own kids' needs aside and think about all of the community's kids and their education. And then when you're off the call, you can go back to being the #1 parent, of course. And in the spirit of searching for our next superintendent, we need a CEO who can manage and lead proactively with vision and strategy. And you need to work to be the board who can direct that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. President Chin, we have no more raised hands.
Great, thank you.
And,
I'm gonna-
I need one more moment to, our Celia Landaverde is with us as translator, and I just need one more moment to set up her channel.
Great, no problem. I'm gonna close public comment for today's meeting. And then just while you set that up, maybe just ask Trustee Corzo to make the language translation services announcement.
Bienvenidos todos. Estamos aquí este sábado. Si alguien gusta traducción, si la tenemos disponible, por favor levanten la mano o también pueden empujar el mundo que está en su pantalla para recibir la traducción. Ok, Sonia, la veo que quiere la traducción. Gracias. Sí, creo que estamos listos. We're ready for the translation, right?
Yes, we are. Thank you. Celia, you're set? I see you nodding. Okay, perfect. Thank you
Gracias, Celia.
very much.
Great, thank you. So now we are going on to item number 6, which is 6.1 is our board governance study session. So I know we have Nicole and Dr. Rose. I don't know if you're going to introduce or start the meeting off, but I know we're ready.
All right, well, we're very pleased to have Nicole Anderson here. She has been the consultant working with our equity task force and also as part of the superintendent search. And she is here today to conduct a governance session with the board. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you. You have an agenda from Nicole that was attached to the posted board agenda.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you. Good to see you. I hope all is well on a lovely Saturday. I know we have a short period of time today to dive into your work, looking at effective governance with an equity lens. We have had an opportunity to hang out with each other quite a bit these last couple of years, and I'm really excited to see the progress, the work, the struggle, productive struggle, through trying to really lead intentionally with an equity lens. So today we're going to spend some time really kind of taking our work and looking at how do we continue to build that effective governance structure so that your equity work can be sustainable, that it can be impactful, because we know that this work is really hard, but it requires effective governance practices to be able to really advance that work. So today we're going to do a little bit more technical work today, less about our adaptive work. I know we do a lot of learning together. We do a lot of discussion. And today we're going to spend more technical time trying to make sure that our structure is in place so that we can continue to advance the work. Acknowledging Lisa, I know you're the newest member of the team, so it's always important just to what I call recenter the work, but it's always great for even our most veteran members on the team. We always go back to recentering, making sure our structure is always solid so that we can advance our work and keep building. So today, again, is your professional learning space. So while it is open to the public, I always want to remind governance teams that effective governance teams actually do spend time learning together. They spend time discussing what's working well, what's not working well. So as the public may not always understand like the process, this is also great for the public to see that governance boards do work on getting better at what they do. They work on learning together. They work on ensuring that anything that needs to be tweaked, that we take care of those things. And they can't always happen in our regular board meetings and our regular business. So I just want to say that it's okay to have professional learning time to work out the bugs, right? To work out the kinks and make sure that we continue to kind of regroup and recenter so we can be effective, not only in our work across all of the different spaces across our district, but of course, doing all of that with an equity lens. So we're going to blend that together today. So before I get started, I know that Joan, I'm going to run, kind of facilitate the agenda, and there's a couple of things I'll pull you in for, but did you have any comments before we get started, before I jump right in with regards to the work?
Oh,
Okay.
just go right ahead.
All right, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a couple of visuals just for you to give a little context for today. And then we're going to jump right into our handbook work in a moment. But sit that to the side just for a second. We're just going to get started. Just a couple of things to front load our day. One is, as I asked you earlier, how you doing? I hope you're doing well. It's important to check in just to make sure as people that you know that there are folks who do care about how you're doing as a person, as individuals. So I want to acknowledge that on a Saturday in the midst of everything. And just want to thank you for your service as a governance team member, that we know you serve many, and you have to be all to many. And that's not always an easy job because you're individuals too. So I want to acknowledge that. But as we come together, obviously, we're not individuals today. We're going into our team space. So I want to just start with reminding you that although, this work is so difficult, I want to just remind you of why we're focused on equity. Okay. And I think Frederick Douglass always has this quote that sticks out to me when we think about how hard this work is and why it's hard, is that as we're focusing on kids, it's a lot easier to build a strong child, right, than to repair a broken woman or man or person. And it's so interesting when you look at this work and why it's so important that as an elementary district, right, that you really think about why it's so important to lead for equity strategically and impactfully. And so as you do that work, it gets really tough to try to build that space because you are dealing with adults, right? And adults who have been harmed by all kinds of inequities. Often say, people have been harmed by racism, right? Everybody. So what happens is when racism comes up, it becomes very difficult. When any form of oppression comes up, it becomes very difficult. But as a governance team, remember, we are always trying to build a space that is safe for us to engage in this work. Very important. And don't forget this step. So again, we all remember our 4 agreements, right? We want to enter into this work. We want to ask our community to stay engaged in this work, even when it gets hard, right? Stay engaged in this work, even when we get uncomfortable, because being uncomfortable is an expectation, right? We can't grow if we're not uncomfortable, right? We want to interrupt some inequity. So what that means is people will be uncomfortable, but we want to remain safe, right? We don't want to attack. We don't want to make people feel like they can't enter into this work, but we do want to recognize discomfort happens when we're interrupting a system. We want everyone to speak their truth, right? Your perspective is so important in this work, and everyone's truth is not going to be the same. And I want to reiterate that right now, because there's a lot in many communities outside of San Mateo, Foster City. Lots of communities have people speaking their truth, and they are different from the others. So it creates conflict and discomfort. But when we speak our truth, we get to learn from each other. Okay. And then last but not least is our expect and accept non-closure. To be okay with the fact that you're going to continuously be working on this journey together. So when we haven't accomplished what we want to accomplish, it's okay. Okay, we have to recognize non-closure, because when we're doing equity-focused work as a governance team, it's going to take time. And so we call it go slow to go fast. And that's a message also that our community sometimes have to hear, is things aren't always going to go as fast. It's not that easy because we're trying to move a system, which is like that big Titanic analogy, right? It's hard to move a system and it does take time. So being okay with non-closure, with the messiness of the work, with the discomfort is something that we have to kind of figure out. And so these are 4 agreements I just recommend you continuously keep in mind as we advance this work together as a team. Okay. So we'll unpack this. I'll make a couple connections in a moment. But what we want to do today is I mentioned recentering our work. So I love using Simon Sinek's golden circle to help us kind of think about this, because the work you're doing, there's so much you're expected to do. But when you start recentering, let's go always back to what's our why, right? So we're going to talk about your equity statement today. Okay, what's your why? Why are we doing this work? Okay, the how of this work, right? Like, how do we get this work done? So we're going to talk about your norms, your protocols, your roles, okay, all the things that are important to go back to that are still rooted into, again, our why. And then the what of our work, okay? Your policy, your priorities, okay? The things that you're going to be doing to make sure as a governance team based on your role that you stay focused on. So Simon Sinek's golden circle is always a good one to go back to when you're thinking about, okay, how do we recenter our work? Like, we got so much going on. Let's just kind of go back to what is our what, our why, and our how. Okay, so we're going to unpack that today. So one reminder when we think about this work is, you remember we're doing this work with a systems approach. So as we continue to unpack your governance work, remember when you read the water system change, it was a while back. And I think, Lisa, I think we sent that over to you. But if you haven't had a chance to get to it, definitely for all of you, I want you to revisit this. Because when we talk about trying to do systems work, we want it to last. And so your article is your reminder about the framework to address the work of equity when we talk about not just where you operate at the policy and practice level and the resource level, right, as a board, this is your role. But also I want you to be thinking about what goes up under that, what comes into play is the people in the system, right? And so as we implement this work, we have to remember the relationships that are critical, that have to be established continuously. The power dynamics, who has the voice in making decisions, right? And then also the mindset, the mental models. Those are always going to be the things we have to consider when we're trying to make system change. And guess what? Equity work is about system change. So we're not just going to be able to solve everything by just changing a policy. And we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk to you about where are you at with your equity policy, right? Where are we at in our space? Where are we thinking about how we shift our resources? All those things are amazing structures that have to be in place to see equitable outcomes. But they don't happen that easily. We have to work on having our positive relationships intact with our teachers, with our classified, with our parents, with our students. How do we make sure student voice is part of our decision making, right? These are all the things to consider, but most critically, when we talk about mental models, the bottom of that mental model, that inverted triangle is about people's belief systems, people's narratives, and that's where culture lies, right? This is where differences lie with people. We have to know those and also recognize that everyone might not believe in some of the work you're doing as a board. Everyone might not believe and understand what equity is. So that's a constant ongoing thing we're going to have to recognize. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example in a minute to kind of unpack this. So one is, when we talked about your effective governance practices, I mentioned that a lot. And when we first met with each other in our first study session, I introduced you to this board assessment. So we went through it and you all talked about, the 8 characteristics of effective governance. And these are the things that you went through and you all kind of rated yourself. And so one of the things that I want to remind you of is, as you're doing this work, we're going to always have to go back to doing a self-assessment. Where are we in our processes? So if you notice again about having a commitment to vision, right? Strong shared beliefs, that's a huge part of this work, which is always a work in progress. Making sure you have collaborative relationships with your staff and your community. Those are all great processes that you're going to have to ensure you have. Holding yourselves accountable, right? Less time that you're spending on the operational stuff, but more about student achievement, right? Those are the priorities we talk about. Data savviness, right? We've talked a little bit about that. How do you use data to really measure the impact of the work based on the vision that you shared? Okay, where are we with that? The 6th one is our board, right? How do we align, monitor, and sustain our resources? That's your budget, right? Big part of your budget is people. You spend 85-90% of your budget on salaries, right? So how do we make sure that we align those resources and make sure we're supporting our equity focused work? Professional development obviously is one of those, which you're participating in now. But most importantly, that you all take time to learn together. and this is a really critical piece of this work. You're learning together constantly with your superintendent, making sure that we're always unpacking what do we know about our values, our commitments, our knowledge together. Okay, now this assessment, again, is one that I always just recommend. Look at it like every quarter. Go back to it. Where are we in our process? Okay, it's one thing to say we believe in something, but do we actually show that in our actions? And so this is a great assessment to provide that. Okay, the last part of the assessment, again, is just the 3 kind of outcomes. Having an equity statement. You got that, right? We took care of that. Excellent. We're going to talk about how to apply that statement today. Having an equity policy. So you have a resolution, you have potentially a policy that you can evolve and have as an adoption. We'll talk about that, but also having a plan, right? How are we going to oversee this work to make sure it lasts? And so this is where your equity task force, leveraging that group, is going to help you be supportive with the plan. So you all are in a great role. I just want to bring this up and hope that you see it as kind of a celebration, that when you look at this assessment, overall, I feel like you all are really moving in the right direction. I think you have a solid foundation for the work, but as you continuously grow and things are changing, you have to always go back and make sure, are we still in a place where we feel we are effective? Okay. And so I want to pause for a second and see if anyone has any comments or thoughts about the board assessment, kind of where you feel you are in terms of what work we've done this past couple of really years together when you look at the totality of it. But how do you feel you are? Any comments, thoughts about your board assessment before we jump into roles and then our handbook? Just go ahead and unmute yourself. Jump right in. Any thoughts, questions about your assessment of where you are in terms of effective governance?
I can start. So I would say, I think overall, we're definitely mostly, there are areas where I feel like we're very effective. There are areas where I feel like we're somewhat effective. I also feel like I'm kind of like looking through like a little bit of a jaded lens, because we're still in a pandemic. And so this is like really difficult, a really difficult time to like, I think like assessing our board right now versus during, you know,
good point,
the before times, or I don't even know what to call it anymore. It's just a different ball game. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. I do feel like, you know, I think maybe by like, I'd be interested to know, you know, the differences between now and like the beginning of next fall, or there's just so much kind of transition happening. But overall, I think there are some areas we can improve, specifically around like the data. We've been getting a lot more data, right? And I think where we're at, like, we just now need to focus. Like, I think we've been getting more data. We're going to continue to get more data. And now I think it's going to be, the focus is going to be on, okay, what do we do next? What do we need to do differently? And so that, I know, is more like the implementation piece. So I'm trying to like, I know that's
good stuff.
a reality, but
good stuff. Yeah, you're on to something. I appreciate that. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit later too about like data and also like questions, like the role of the board and looking at data and the questions you can ask and to help measure the impact of the work. So powerful. And I want to acknowledge, yes, this is hard to look at. I shared this with you all pre-pandemic, by the way. This document's been around longer than the pandemic. And as you can imagine, like, does it look different now than it did before? And it shouldn't, which is why we're doing this workshop, right? Like, it shouldn't look different, right? Yes, the pandemic is an unprecedented moment in educational history. So I want to just say hands down, yes, this is very difficult. But the core of effective governance is that we really stay in the same effective characteristics, regardless of whatever winds blow our way, right? That's why it's so important to just have that foundation, because we could take the pandemic, put that to the side, it'll be something different. Like, you all remember governance before the pandemic. It was always something that was like in that moment, that heavy thing that sat before us. So what's important is that when we talk about equity work, right? Equity work is going to create a whole lot of other storms besides the COVID, right? So that's why we got to have solid foundation for our practices. So Noe, I appreciate you pulling that out because it's a great example. Lots of boards are struggling with like pre-pandemic now, like what changed for us as a board? And really nothing should have changed. As a matter of fact, we should have really leaned into our governance practices during the pandemic because we have to really stay effective even when we have pressure from voices and different ways of, I mean, just the personal experiences that you all have had, right? It has transformed the way we govern, right? Because of what we brought to the space where we've seen like humans be really impacted in like never before. So it's important to remember, how do we stay grounded as a governance team? And this is a great assessment to do so. Ken, I think you were going to jump in.
Oh, my only comment was, and you had just mentioned that we had done this pre-pandemic. And so the idea is like, you know, I think it would be good for us to go back and sort of look at it, even though you might say that some things haven't changed. I kind of feel like, you know, especially as we make this sort of leadership transition, that would be good sort of for us to go back and just look at ourselves over the last year. And just to see, especially also give the opportunity to Lisa, who hasn't had the opportunity to probably fill this out. So
yeah, absolutely.
It'd be great to do some sort of update.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Lisa, why don't you jump in? I know it's kind of a first time going through this in terms of, I mean, we've been together for a few sessions now, but in terms of just like your thoughts about the what you see within the self-assessment, anything that sticks out to your questions you might have.
You know, it's interesting to me because I feel like I've seen this before from attending these meetings before as a parent. But now I'm looking at it from a different lens and a different side. And, you know, just from the board meetings that I've attended since 2017, I definitely see the board moving towards a more equitable stance. You know, of course, with anything, implementation is always a challenge because you're challenging old way of thinking and trying to develop a new way of thinking. You know, and it's very challenging to do so. I'm looking forward to being a part of this and a part of this work, much more so from like the inside as opposed to looking at it from the outside and wondering how this is going to affect me and the children at my children's school.
Well said.
And I just see it as a work in progress. I mean, it's never going to be a finished work. You know, it's always going to need to be, I don't want to say modified, but just fine-tuned to how, you know, basically everything evolves out in the world.
Yeah, I appreciate that feedback as a newer member to the team. It is definitely, I want to glean from what you said about shifting my understanding of my role, like going from parent to board member, right? And that's a really powerful, you know, space to be in, to be able to recognize that so that effective governance can happen as a team. And so, and I'll give you an example. There's a visual, you all have seen this before, but I always like to go back to this because it gives us a great reminder and a visual about our roles, right? And when we look at our roles, we think about, you know, there's that dotted line, right? And so like when I go from, okay, I'm a parent, now I'm a board member, right? So notice on here, there's nowhere it says parents, right? Nowhere where it says we're teachers, we're anything except just there's a superintendent and there's a board member, right? And the reality is that with governance teams, you know, really always recentering our work around our roles is super important. In recognizing that how I view this work is different. Even though, for example, I think I've shared this with you all, like I had the pleasure of doing a campaign management for a board member who was a 35-year veteran out of that district that they ran for the school board. And one of the things to this day we talk about, I still kind of advise him and talk to him about his experiences, but I talk about, look, you are no longer a principal, you're no longer director, you're no longer the person who owes everybody in the community, and literally you sub for the principals, right? So you go to the schools and everybody thinks like you're still the principal. It's like, you're the board member now. And even your discussions, right? How you view the work has to also shift. And so this is always a great image just to also kind of recenter our work, right? Is to remember we have two different lanes, and you see that dotted line. There's the role of the superintendent, right? There's the role of the board. And remember, the board is that 30,000 foot. You have the vision, you set the goals, you create policy, but you also monitor how that policy lands in the trenches, which is where superintendent and their staff is required to implement the work. So this is really hard because you have to work together. And that's why there's that dotted line versus a solid line, because it's not that we don't ever cross each other's lanes, but what it does mean is we have to still remember our roles. And so that dotted line is where we're going to talk about your handbook, because the handbook really talks about what is our culture, right? Like, what is the culture of our governance team, right? Like how you all operate in San Mateo Foster City could be very different from the board in Vallejo, right? And the board that's all the way in Corona Norco, the board that is all the way across in Vista, down in Southern Cal. I mean, there are so many different ways that governance teams operate. There's some basic constructs, right? Which is where I went back here. Obviously, you have effective characteristics of boards, right? Functioning boards, effective boards. But then you have, what are the clear roles? Obviously, you have laws that govern you, right? You have your Brown Act. You have all these different policies, regulations that govern. But what does become very unique is how you all operate together. How do you treat each other? How you communicate? What is that kind of culture of the board? And that's where the dotted lines come in. And this is where I want you all to start thinking about, let's go back to our handbook with the lens of understanding that how we operate together, understanding our roles, we have to have a process for that. Okay. And so there's a culture that currently exists, but it always is a culture that can evolve based on who you are as individuals, right? Each of you learn a different way, you communicate a different way, you have a different vision possibly, but your role as a board is to come together, right? And it's also to make sure we have a cohesive way of operating. So this is where our handbook discussion comes into play. All right, so what I want to do is I want to take an opportunity to have you get your handbook out so it's handy, and then we're going to take an opportunity to kind of go through the different processes that are going to impact, again, how you come together as an effective governance team. And the way it's going to work today is we're going to review, but then we're going to have make some revisions, and then you'll actually adopt any revisions, amendments to your handbook at a later board meeting. Okay, so I want to make sure that's really clear that you're not taking action today. You're just revising, and you did it last February, which is great. You're revisiting about a year later. You always, when you're recentering the work and onboarding new board members, it's always good to go back to where's our documentation that talks about how we're going to work together. Okay, that's your guide. And so there's a resource that also is really helpful, and want to just kind of throw that out there for you, that for all of you, if you haven't had a chance to get a hold of the governance core, this is always a really great resource to go back to in terms of, again, just unpacking like the how we work together. Some great resources there. And I know CSBA uses it, works, I know with Davis Campbell quite a bit with the MIG trainings too. So I think it's also a great way to kind of have a resource to go back to when you're looking at, okay, how do we really like see this work together? So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment and want to make sure, does everyone have their handbook out? All right,
And
perfect. Some of you may have it.
We did get those books so that you
Good,
just
good.
so everybody has them.
Good to hear. I was glad to hear that. I think that's gonna be a great resource for y'all, and potentially you can use that as like your own book study for your study sessions moving forward. Does everyone have theirs though handy? And I know some people like to have theirs, your hard copies. Some of you may have it in front of you. I can pull it up on the screen so the community can see it as we go through each page, but I do want to spend some significant time, and this is kind of what I call the technical work. This is my personally not my favorite part of governance, because, and I'm going to tell you very candidly why. Every governance team has a handbook, right? That's a necessity for you to have. My concern is once we finish with this, handbooks typically go and sit on a shelf somewhere. Okay, and so why I'm bringing it up before we go into this is as you make revisions, I want you to really see this as a living document that you go back to recenter when you're not sure, right? To remind us like, oh yeah, this is what we said. And then we want to internalize this and actually implement this with fidelity. Okay, so I want to say that very clearly because again, this is why this is not my favorite part of this work, because at the end of the day, does this handbook become something that really guides us or does it go sit on the shelf? And that's something you have to think about when we talk about recentering our work and always remembering our role as a board is to remember we have in our handbook our norms, our protocols, right? How we're going to communicate, how we run our meetings, right? And so what I want to do is kind of begin with taking about, I want to give you about 5 minutes. And this 5 minutes is really critical. I know you all have seen your handbook. I know you all like read it every day, right? It's sitting right next to your bed. I'm just kidding. And that's a sarcastic comment, but I want you to just take about 5 minutes, just thumb through, right? And just get refamiliarized with your handbook. Okay. And then we're actually going to go through section by section. Okay. And just make some revisions. Okay. But I want to just be fair to you. Just go take about 5 minutes, just pause, like just go back, just kind of familiarize yourself with some of the key things that you have. And then we're going to go section by section. Okay. Any questions? All right, perfect. Do you want some handbook music or would you like just quiet time? All right, we'll give you about 5 minutes. For the community who is watching, I believe the handbook was part of the packet, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know, Joan, if you can clarify, but if anyone is wanting to follow along. And also, I believe the handbook is on your
Yes,
website.
it is posted.
Yeah,
It is
perfect.
posted.
All right, so we'll go about 5 minutes, just refamiliarizing yourself. All right, so are we ready to just go into the sections by section and just break down some of the details? Or you need a little bit more time just to refresh? All right, good, good, good. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. As you know, your handbook, very customized. What I love about it is it's very much kind of like customized to what works for you all. It's not just necessarily just what everyone else has, but you have some specific things to your culture. So I just want to acknowledge that. And so what I want to do is I want to look at like 4 sections specifically that we want to kind of go into in detail. And then what we're going to do is talk about specific kind of scenarios and specific impacts, which I show on your agenda around like your meeting minutes, your kind of protocol around emailing, communications, things of that nature. So we're going to go into those details, but I want to just start with your handbook. So I want to start with your norms in particular. I'm not going to go deep into the first couple of pages because obviously that's just kind of your vision. Your equity definition, I do want to say probably needs to be updated. So I think, Joan, you already had that notated. Not a big deal. Don't need to go through too much of that since you just did that. Obviously, your team, you got to update your team on your page, your first, your roster. Okay, don't want to go too much into that. But as far as your actual table of contents, we'll adjust that as necessary. So I'm going to skip that for now. Okay. But what I want to do is I want to go specifically into norms, but I want you to just bring attention to your value statement. Okay. So you have a value statement on page 1. And so the way I want us to kind of look at each of the sections we go through is that you look at what are kind of the pluses, like, are we good? Okay. Then what are some things that may need to change? And then we'll have a discussion for each section. Okay, so what works well, what needs to change, and then what discussion we need to have. And we'll go through each section one by one. Okay, and if you feel like you're being rushed at any point through the sections, just let me know. Okay, Nicole, we need more time for this. Okay, but I want to make sure we can get through each section one by one. So I'm going to start just with this on page 1. If y'all on page 1, you see your value statement. So what we value as a governance team. So take a look. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different statements. Take a look. What's working well for that? Kind of your pluses. Okay. Let's start there. What do you like about those? What works well with your value statements? Anyone just unmute yourself, jump right in. So we're on the pluses. What's
I
worked
would
well?
just
Mhm.
work well.
Yeah, so
I
we're on
think
the
that
pluses.
for me, what's working well is I think that we've been focusing and prioritizing every student and trying our best to collaborate. I think there's some challenging times right now in that, but I think our focus when it comes to the meetings are on students and what's best for kids.
Okay. Okay. So you like your values. You feel like this encapsulates what you all value as a team. Okay. Anyone else want to chime in about what you feel in terms of these values? These are what's working well.
I feel like they're all really good.
Okay.
Yeah, I like all of them, but
Okay.
I think our diversity piece. I think yeah, that one. I think I think there has to be more work done not on our governance team, but so I guess I don't know. I'm gonna be quiet now. Basically, I'm thinking ahead. This is a good value statement for our team still.
Yeah.
I feel like.
Perfect. And yeah, Noelle, I think your brain is going into how you measured it, right? Like, is this happening? Because we're just talking about, we value this. These are our beliefs. Remember back to our board assessment, right? Is do we have shared values, beliefs? So that's all this is do we value these things, right? Not are we good at them per se, or do we all these things happening, but this is what we value, right? So this is what we come with as a team. So we all feel like these are still the values you have as a shared group.
I was going to say too, and just jump in with,
Mhm.
I think, yes, as a board, I think these are great. And I
Okay.
think we follow them wonderfully. Do I think that the translation into what gets carried out at the school level? I don't think that this uniformly applies across the district.
Okay. So I hear you, Lisa, going into like, yes, we value these things. How they show up is where we have to really look at, which is not what this is for. This is not necessarily how you
Right.
carry it out, but I see what you're saying. Okay.
Right. It's just,
Okay.
it's like that dotted line in
Okay.
your
Yep.
thing. It's like, it's like that dotted line is no longer dotted. It's solid.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Does anyone feel like any of these value statements need to be changed? So this would be a great time to chime in. As I hear a lot of like, yes, these are values. We agree. Like these work for us. But is there anything here that may need to be changed, that may not be working, that you may want to adjust?
One of the things I was thinking about as Noelia started to share, and I don't know if this is where you were going with this, but this is where my mind went with this around the diversity piece.
Mm-hmm.
There's something to me around, and I think that this has definitely emerged as we think about reopening and kind of, there's something around like how we prioritize voices that we aren't hearing from currently in the same way. So I don't know if that falls under diversity or community, but there's something around uplifting, holding space for, ensuring that we're prioritizing voices of our students and their families that traditionally haven't been successful in our school system. And so I could see that falling under one of those two areas, but
Okay.
that to me is something that I feel like is missing. And maybe that doesn't go under values, but
Right.
to me, it feels like an important piece to be considered.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's hard about this one is when you do value statements, often you want to go into like how this looks on the ground level, right? Which is a good reflection. But I think this page is really just, do we believe in this? Right? Like, it's like, yes or no. And that's really it, right? Like, do we believe in this? Now, how it's carried out is where we have to go into our other sections, right? But do you feel like wording wise, I think Sharon, Noelia, what you were sharing, do you feel like the words captured here really capture what you all value? And that would be it. What you value, right? So I see the words committed, dedicated, prioritize. We value our students. You're calling out students. So do y'all feel like these are kind of your core values that you can still stick to? Or is there anything that needs to be changed here?
One other thing to throw out there. Is there a place for a value around, I'm trying to think about like what the right term, the term that comes to mind is like anti-racism. But is there like a term for like very specifically addressing and tackling the systems and structures? I don't know. So these, you know, equity and inclusion gets at it in one way, but it doesn't get at it in a way of like confronting those systems and structures. And I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking about that. I think about that with like the SRO resolution and just other things. So I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about. And anti-racism might not be the term. I can't think of another one that I'm trying to think of like another one, but potentially something like that more specifically confronts that could be.
Yeah, so just kind of terms that are more explicit is what I hear you saying. I think you all have some very general statements that no matter what the topic is, no matter what form of oppression exists, I do think that you capture that. That's my opinion in this when you talk about inclusion of every student, right? So if you started to go too deep, then you're going to have a really wordy value statement, right? But I do agree that if you all feel like you want to be more explicit about anything, then this is a place you could do it. I'm not sure that calling out one form of oppression over another would be as valuable, because then what we're do is our values are now kind of going more deeply into specific, what I call equity, racial equity gaps, for example, right? So then you're going specific. So that's why I go like sometimes value statements are very broad on purpose, right? So I don't know. It's just my thought. I'm trying to find it too, Shara, where it fits in. But I feel like you called it out already when you talk about equity, inclusion, and inclusive and equitable practices. I feel like it encapsulates that. It's just not explicit around anti-racism, if that makes sense. And your values may show up in your resolutions, by the way, right? Your values may show up specifically in other spaces, but this is kind of a big picture. Tell me your thinking. Do you think you want to add anything, or you feel like you captured it in your broad value statement?
I'll just say that I don't think it hurts to put that as a value. I think if that's, you know, if like we have been doing a lot of work around that, and I kind of think like taking a strong stance and putting it in writing and saying that's included as our governance team values is something that I wouldn't be opposed to adding, just because it is kind of, nothing is very specific on here. And so I think, I mean, it doesn't hurt to add it.
Okay. Tell me where you might place that. Like, where would that show up on here?
To me, it would just be a separate bullet point.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm thinking.
And again, I like, that was the word that popped into my mind, but it can be something that's, that doesn't have to be the term. I think it can be something that's more inclusive, but I do think there's something around like taking a firm stance against those things as a board, that is something that we value. It's encompassed in equity inclusion, sort of, but I don't necessarily agree that like, I think you can be focused on equity and inclusion and also not proceed as a board in an anti-racist way, or in a I don't know, where you're kind of like really confronting injustices head on. I don't know like what the exact right term is, but it's something around like, no, we're going to actually tackle these issues head on, and that's something that we're going to take a strong stance on.
So can I push you all to think about that? If you go back like 3 pages, you have your equity statement, which I think encapsulates that in itself, right? It's kind of your statement you pulled out, which is not only values, right? But obviously you're explicitly calling it out. So I feel like you have done that. I'm not sure there's value in putting it into your value statement, but it's up to you all. It's your board handbook. But I think your equity statement is really your kind of standalone, right? Here's what we believe equity is. And I think it calls it out. Remember, you all added words like that correlate with any social or cultural or racial factor when we talked about removing the predictability of success or failure. So I think you all called it out in your statement. I'm just not sure that you want to, kind of add it back in the values, or you want to, just have it be kind of, it stood alone in your equity statement, which is part of why we create this work, right? With governance teams, like you need to have a statement, right? So I think you've called it out, but if you want to add it to your values, it's fine. I don't think it matters either way to me, but I think you've called it out very explicitly in your equity statement that you just amended at your, 2 board meetings ago, want to say.
Can I just ask something as well? I totally believe, taking a stand as a district against racism is completely important. But then where do we draw the line? I'm like, what about ableism? What about those with disabilities in the district? I mean, that's a huge thing for this district, completely from a disability standpoint. It's like, how do we address the socioeconomic disadvantaged? I guess that's just my thing. And please, I'm open for explanations and education. But to me, if we're looking at a value statement, it just feels like it needs to be broader so that we can put all of that under an umbrella. Because I just feel like there's a chance that we would start either leaving a group out, or we would, just end up with this, value statement that's 10 pages long.
Yeah. Anyone have a response?
Yeah, I am in support of including it. And I just want to say that in my experience, I understand the point that you're making, Lisa, but also, working within different systems, in our, like my experience working within different systems is that racism is kind of like underlying everything, like within the disabled community, within the foster care community, within every system. I think like addressing racism kind of improves everything for everyone. I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm saying that properly, but I think that it does stand alone in a way, and working on that actually betters everything for everybody. And that's been my experience, right? Working in the different systems that I've worked in. So that's part of why I think it should be able to stand alone. But I don't know if anyone else wants to share how they feel about that.
So like I said, that was just the initial term that came off. I would also be okay with something like interrupting inequitable practices, right? But I think the point is, because if you're saying like the equity definition should suffice, then presumably that means like we don't need to include equity and inclusion anyways, right? Because we have the equity definition, right? Like I don't know, like to me it's like, no, this is a space where we call out additional values. To the point about like, I also think for me, like the anti-racism piece is important because I think very often in this work, the counterpoint is like, well, what about everything else? And doesn't mean that you're not focused on everything else, but talking about race explicitly makes people very uncomfortable. And so then to say like, well, if we talk about everything, then we don't have to specifically talk about race. And I think kind of to Noelia's point, like that underlies pretty much all, like that doesn't mean that there aren't inequities that are outside of race. There absolutely are, and those are things that we need to address. But within those inequities, race is an additional inequity, right? So if we're talking about special education, for example, there are inequities between our special education population and our general education population. And within our special education population, there are inequities that are based on race. And so calling that out explicitly, I think, I just think sometimes that it's uncomfortable. And so we like to go to a place of like, let's do this so that it's not uncomfortable. And I don't, and so I don't know. I personally think that it is important to call it explicitly. I would also be fine with potentially like doing that and also saying interrupting inequitable practices, or I'm just looking at the equity definition to see if there are like other pieces in there like that we could pull out that kind of more explicitly call out like the ways in which we address these things head on, or that we're committed to doing that, right? Because I think that's a harder thing to do than say we value equity and inclusion. And if we're like really wanting to move systems and structures as a board, like we need to start doing that by being comfortable and having uncomfortable language in our value statement, right? Like that is how we model how we do that as a community, in my perspective, from my perspective.
You
I was
do
just going
have
to ask,
a statement. I'm sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
I was just saying that you do have a statement that might help in that examining and eliminating biases. That was added in most recently in your last update.
Yeah, I'll put it on the screen too, if it helps to
Yeah.
have a visual. So
Do
this
you
is,
have the most recent? Yes, there
so
it
this
is.
is the one where I showed where the red is where you made amendments to it.
Yeah.
So see where you called out and you added in these pieces. So I think what I hear the group saying, and Alice, I know you were going to jump right in, is that you may want to, in your value, say very clearly call out as a board in our value statement, we want to more clearly be explicit about language that we value. And so go ahead, Allison, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, just looking at some other missions and value statements of organizations, the idea of collective liberation also is one that kind of seems like it might be a good, like what you call it, and then we could define that it means working together against oppression, and I mean there's different definitions, but I thought like that might be like on the right track if we're looking for a term.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts, Ken? Did you want to jump in? I know I'm not going to belabor the values piece. We're going to get to our other stuff, our norms and our protocols. I think is important. But any last thoughts? We're taking.
No, I'm so I'm appreciating the discussion. I also looked up what our last equity statement was that we approved, and so I know we have that, and I'm glad you put that up on the screen. You know, when we started the discussion, I was thinking, okay, you know, going back to your, I guess it was your Venn, it wasn't your Venn diagram, but it was the circles. They weren't concentric circles, but it was about the why. And to me, this is sort of like the why. This is why we're here. This is what we're doing, right? You know, I know it's easy for us to get past this sort of why and immediately start jumping into like, what are we doing and how are we doing, stuff like that. But the value statements are nice and short and sweet because this is like, this is why we're doing this. I can see why, you know, going above and beyond sort of our mission statement and our equity, our new equity statement, to add something here about being sort of an anti-racist. I think you can kind of allude to it through our equity statement and also the values of the equity inclusion, and then also the just diversity paragraph here or statement. But it does, you know, it does lead to the fact that, you know, we are moving, well, we're definitely moving in this direction. So, I mean, we're, you know, dove right in. And so I feel like, you know, maybe there does need to be something. I like how in a lot of ways, like the values here are all very positive. And so what Trustee Proctor brought up was some idea to sort of to add it, but to have like in some ways a positive spin on it. I'm not saying spin, but in a negative way, but like to have a positive way of how we go about this. I mean, I'm open to that.
So how do you feel about this? Again, we're just making revisions, kind of discussing, and then you all will come back to this, right, and make final, you know, decision. But what I can do is I've taken some feedback and I can give you, kind of send back to you two kind of versions, either an extra bullet or we can infuse words like anti-racism and all forms of oppression to really be more explicit about our beliefs. Does that sound like that, what kind of where I'm hearing you want to do is just make sure you're more explicit and that we can really call out those values, because that's what we do value and we want to call it out. So am I hearing that? Does that sound okay? All right, good. Okay, so we're moving along. I don't want to make you feel rushed, but again, you still have your norms, your protocols, your meeting guidelines that I want to get to. So I want to make sure, but I think I hear you clear, loud and clear. We want to explicitly be clear about our values that have evolved, right, since our last handbook in February. So that makes a lot of sense. And so I do appreciate the discussion. And with your permission, I'll move to our norms. Is that okay? All right, cool. So keeping your equity lens on, I appreciate it. So your norms actually show up in two ways. So you have norms on page 2, and then you have norms on page number 4, which is more about like discussion. So I wanted to start with page 2 with just the behaviors of the board. So again, your norms are kind of like how we, kind of work together specifically. So I want you to take a look at this, and I want you to just pull out, anything that you feel like is like, yes, this really speaks to our norms. And I want to just read them real quick. So the behaviors by which the governance team is characterized as follows. Okay. And again, keyword is behavior, how we interact, work together. Okay. So we keep the best interests of all children as a priority. Okay. So first bullet, be respectful. We give respect and dignity to each interaction. Be prepared. We come to meetings prepared and ready to deliberate. Be transparent. We communicate openly and honestly with one another and the community. Be inclusive. We commit to representing and empowering the entire community. Be collaborative. We work collaboratively towards a common vision and purpose. And be unified. We respect and support the board's decisions. All right, so what kind of sticks out is like the positives, the things that are working really well. I want to start there, and then we'll go into what maybe we need to adjust. So I'll do it this way. Let's start with be respectful. Okay. We all good with be respectful. We come to, we give respect and dignity to every interaction. Do you feel like that's a norm that you still want to keep? You think that works?
Yeah, I like all of them. I want to keep all of them.
So you like them all? Okay. All right. Okay. So let me back up that way, because I want to just see what's working for you. I know your brains are spinning on, okay, I know what you're doing. You're doing an assessment, right? Like, I don't know if we do well at this, right? And I get it, right? But right now you just want to kind of back up to what do we expect of ourselves, okay? What do we envision of how we work together? So Noelia says, I like them all. Anyone else agree with Noelia? You like them all, you're good, you want to keep them. Okay, I see Ken's like, yeah. Lisa, I see a shake head, yeah. Allison, good. Shara?
Yes, but I have one I want to add. Are we
Okay.
not there yet?
Yeah, no, I was going to say we can move right into, okay, so what might we want to adjust? And then we need to also have a little discussion. So I want to make sure. So go ahead, Shara, why don't you jump in as what you feel is missing, and then let's talk about a little bit of a discussion. I want to pull out a few of these. So go right ahead.
So I think I have one I want to add, and then I have another comment. So I'm on like the same kind of like thread here, where something around like be brave, be bold, like something around like making the hard decisions, taking the hard stances sort of piece. Again, like coming back to like keeping the best interests of all children as a priority. So something around that, just like continuing to push ourselves to do that, which I know that we're doing, but continuing to do that. And then the, I guess the follow-up to that is just like more around, and I think we talked about all of this when we originally did it, but like, what are the ways that because I agree with kind of what you were sharing, like, this is only as valuable as we make it a living document. And so how do we do that? Right. Yep. Like, how do we keep coming back to these? How do we come back? How does our community know that this is what we value, that these are what our norms are? How do we check in and hold each other accountable to these, like at every meeting? And so I think that putting something in here around that is going to be really helpful, because otherwise it's just like we do this once a year and then we're never cycling back to it. And that's not helpful,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not a good use of our time then.
Absolutely. That's why I say this is not my favorite part of doing board study session. However, I want to say this, Shar, one thing that may come back to you when we go to the protocols, that may come back to what that language is. Because I know what you're saying, like, how do we be accountable or be decisive, once we make decision, like, I know what you're saying. And so it shows up in your protocol section. So a part of me wants to say, maybe we don't, add it yet until you really see, like, maybe we've covered it here, but that language, you're right. Like, it could be something that because I want all of you to see that, but I hear what you're saying. And it
Those were two separate comments though. One is like the accountability piece, the part
Yep.
about like being bold.
Yep.
That to me is like a norm. So that to me doesn't fit
Yep.
somewhere
Okay.
else.
Okay.
Those are two
That's
kind of
helpful.
separate points.
Got it. Okay. That helps. Okay. Anyone want to chime in and maybe share if you have questions for Shar based on that kind of addition to your norms?
So after the 2 words, it says be respectful. It would be like be brave or bold, whichever word you like better. What's the sentence? Is it, take a stand on difficult issues and articulate those commitments, or, what would be the commitment we're making under be brave and bold?
I mean, I can throw something out there, but this is just me. Just something like, we commit to making, I don't know, decisions that interrupt inequitable practices, even when they're not popular, or something like that,
Got it.
that kind of like follows from what we said before, but other people might have ideas.
Mm-hmm. Shara, I'm going back to like the board assessment because there's some interesting language around like data driven and the word accountability driven, but making tough decisions usually is centers around you make it based on data, not just emotions, right? Because I think that's a big piece for boards is that when we make decisions as governance team, a lot of times it's easier to lean towards whatever that kind of pressure is, right? Whatever those voices are versus like the facts, right? And data. And I feel like that might go into that, as we commit to making data-driven decisions. It's something in that, because I know exactly what you mean. And again, those are not always popular decisions, right? When we start to look at data. So I think I hear you. I'm just trying to throw out some more language that may be helpful with that sentence that Joan asked about.
Something on the order of we commit to make data-driven decisions to interrupt inequitable practices, or something on that order. Yeah. Okay, I'm understanding, just to clarify.
Sure, you mentioned 2 things. Well, I'm sorry, with the second one was, can you please remind us?
Sorry?
So there was 2 things. One was sort of be bold, be brave, but the other one that you had mentioned said there was 2 separate ones. And so I was.
Oh no, it was just around like how we monitor whether we're doing it, like how we make it more of a living document.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So I think I want to throw this sentence out. I think I might have one. And here's where I want to, keep it at, governance level work is, we make data-driven decisions focused on equity and policies to improve student achievement. And that kind of speaks to, again, not only equity, but remember the role of the board is policy making decisions, right? So I want to be really clear, because remember, sometimes we make decisions that maybe, when I go back to that implementation superintendent role, like this is where we want to call out our role as a board, right? And our norms really call out, we make decisions based on policy, because that's where you live, in the policy world. So does that help a little bit in terms of, it talks about data-driven, equity is called out, that's focused on equity and policy that impacts students, because now we're calling out also that piece around, these are your norms. And when you put this in writing, I want you to keep in mind what we're saying, right? Like this is a living document. We're holding ourselves to. This is our norm, right? So when we talk about making decisions, this is where we go into that whole like priorities versus we talk about hot topics or things that maybe one community member wants, and it's really not equity focused, and it's not policy. It's not around policy. It's around things that really have no business at the board level. I just want to throw that out there because that absolutely happens, especially when equity work comes to mind. People will interpret equity in many ways. And remember, I used that joke about people will be interested in, like, the schools aren't equitable because that school has 3 trees planted in front and that school has 5 trees planted in front. And that can come to the board meeting. That is not our role, right? So I'm saying it for that context, right? Because remember, your role as a board is not to do implementation of practices. And so go ahead, Ken.
One clarification is
Uh-huh.
this is the norms of the governance team.
Yes.
Which actually does include the superintendent. So it's the norms for all of us. So while we talk about, the superintendent's role versus our role, I look at these norms as like it's everybody. So I get your point about the distinction. But I look at these are the norms for all of us. So I think that there's a role for sort of what I think Shar would like to add. So I think when I look at it that way.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And this totally applies to superintendent who has to implement this work. Right. So I think it's important. But I called out student achievement for a reason. Right. If you're going to call out how we make decisions, you got to call out what is it for? And I say that it's really your decision on what you say is your, kind of norms as a group, but this is important to just really keep yourself centered on when we make bold decisions that may not be popular, as Shar said, right? For what? It's about kids, right? That's our norm. And if it's about adults, I'm calling it out. If it's about adult interest, that's where you're going to find your decision making and your norms to actually come back to haunt you. Because when you go back to your norms, your handbook, it's like, wait, we weren't really clear about why we're making decisions. And that's why I threw out the data part too, because that helps you stay centered on it, right? The data is always going to be centered around our babies. So you want to sit on that one and because you're all going to go back to this, right? You're going to go back and say, okay, hey, this is what we agree to, but or we seem like we're in the right space with adding that additional bullet. You all agree to that for now? Okay. No final decisions. Okay. All right. All right. So, but it sounds like overall you all are good with these. I want to call out a couple of things that may be helpful with some of these, just as far as our discussion. And so one is I want to just call out, obviously, respect and dignity. I think that interaction that you all have with each other, I think that, when you do your own assessment, you probably agree, like, we're a pretty respectful group together, right? I've seen some boards that are not respectful with each other. And so I think that that's something that you always want to call, that's how we behave together. The one that's on here about coming to meetings prepared and ready to deliberate. So this one I just want to call out in terms of it will show up in your protocols, but just to give context, this is where we look at we do our homework, right? We read our board packets, right? We're prepared to be able to discuss and answer questions. And that's a norm that has to be a commitment to each other, because all it takes is one person who just kind of misses it. And then what happens, right? Your board meetings become longer, right? Because we may have things that we're not understanding. We don't have the context because the superintendent staff put together, right, these packets to give you information. So a lot of times just the basic structures of board meetings become very long because we're just not as prepared, right? And so it's not any individual I'm saying this to, I'm saying it as a collective board. This is a great norm to always revisit. Like, am I doing my homework? Am I prepared based on what the agenda items are? And we'll talk about the agenda building in a moment, but the reality is that this is that preparation piece, right? And so I think it's really important to always go back to your norms, like, where are we at on this? Because this is really critical when we talk about advancing the work. There's another piece here that I want to call out that I'm sure you've heard before around the concept of being transparent. So communicating openly, honestly with one another in the community. So I want to speak to this because I think this is a really hard one when, again, go back to the role of a board, role of a superintendent. And so something, for example, when things happen in a community, when things happen in the school community, district community. Great example is like HR, right? Staffing issues, right? Things come up that are confidential, that cannot be shared, but it may be perceived as you're not sharing information, right? Things like that, you have to think about what is our norm around how we communicate when there may be things that come up, right? That the community may want to know, but really are not privy to that because it's a legal issue, right? So how do you even communicate how you communicate things, right? That's transparency. Sometimes community members don't understand that you can't share every detail of everything you do. Okay, all districts right now are dealing with the reopening piece, right? You all are no different. And there are folks who are like, hey, you're not transparent with us. And the reality is this, right? Is that there are so many nuances to running a school district that there's no way you could share every detail, right? But how do you create a communication structure that people know the process, right? And that's something to think about when you think about our norms. What is our norm for communication, right? How do we communicate what's going on so their community feels like we're telling them what they need to know, right? Timeliness, where we communicate, how we communicate, those frequency, like all of that is something to think about when we talk about communication. Because honestly, what happens is when that doesn't happen, then the assumption is that people aren't being honest. And that's what often happens when you're in a public space, right? But as a person who knows what happens behind the scenes, sometimes as a person on the other end, they don't know that, right? So to defend community members for a moment who are like, you're not being transparent, it's because people don't know the system. So we have to be better at educating our community about what is happening. And sometimes that may show up in your conversations in your board meetings around even your board reports, right? It's just sharing processes, like this is how this happens, right? Sharing an opportunity for people to know kind of the nuances of what happens with governance. These study sessions are opportunities for anyone who watches and likes to sit on a Saturday and watch a board meeting, a study session, right? How do you ensure that the community knows the process and it's very transparent, right? So that's something to think about and something to work through. And when we get to our protocols, we'll get a little bit deeper into that. But I wanted to call that out. I also want to call out about inclusiveness. And this is something that I think is important when we talk about, how do we effectively recognize and respond to public concerns, right? To public comments. And this is one that's kind of a hot topic for lots of boards around the nation. So I want to give context as this is not just a San Mateo Foster City thing. So a couple of things I want you to think about with your norms of being inclusive. And one is you have your protocol for public comment, right? Like that's something that you're required to do in your board meetings. How you do that obviously is, presidents, collaborate with the board agenda building process. And obviously there are moments where how you build your agendas, right? You have multiple agenda items, like you allow public comment, right? And then there's public comment about non-agenda items. So when we talk about being inclusive, right, with an equity lens, keep in mind that how that's perceived, right, has to be clearly created and understood by your community. So that as you have voices that need to be heard, no matter if it's voices that agree with our truth or not, how do we ensure that we have an inclusive opportunity to be heard, but then also recognize how we effectively respond? Okay, so when we talk about inclusion, right, when you sit in your board meetings, obviously, like we don't respond to public comment. Like that's not really our role, right? It's to respond. It's not a dialogue. It's a board meeting, right? The public just can come and watch, right? So I say that again, it's a board meeting. The public is invited to come watch, right? There's not necessarily a requirement for you to have a response. However, as you want to be inclusive, right? You want to make sure we have relationships that are collaborative with our community. You do want to consider in our protocol being inclusive, how does that response look, right? And what's appropriate, what's not. So remember, we're 5 of us, right? Obviously, we have a board meeting, so we want to have a collective voice in how we respond. So the statements you make, right? Those are things that need to be considered as how do we have a collective voice when we respond to anything? It's not just individual responses. Outside of our board meetings, right? We always want to be mindful of, even though people reach out to us, right? Individually, how do we respond effectively so that we're still collectively sharing those shared voice, vision, and values as board members, even though we individually were reached out to? So I always think about things like all of you have like social media, for example, right? Everybody has social media. It's just kind of the new way we communicate, right? Which is an important platform. but being mindful also of how do we ensure that we're effectively recognizing and responding to our community is something we're going to have to revisit, because what happens often is that individually we may have a response, but it doesn't reflect the whole board. And so I want to say that because it goes into your other norm around being unified, right? So we respect and support the board decisions. So anytime we have a collective voice, right, a board decision is a final decision, whether we have all 5 of us agree, but we have our majority, we make a decision, we are a collective board. And we have to remember individually, we don't want to always respond with just our individual view, but we want to respond with a collective view from the board. And that's a work in progress for all boards. I want to say that, but I want to call it out in your norms, because you're going to go back to, if this is a living document, you're going to have to wrestle with as a board family, how are we doing with our norms around being transparent, communicating, responding effectively, but also recognizing that our communication has to be from a shared voice. Okay, so I want to just pause for a second and see what questions, thoughts you have, because I want to move from the norms into your actual protocols, which is more about some of the details. But for your norms, just pause in there. Thoughts, comments you have. I think you have great norms, by the way. I think they're perfect, but it's just kind of like, Shara, you mentioned, like, we don't want it to just close after this meeting and we never go back to these and not really look at what we agreed to is how we function together. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I don't know. Trustee Corzo, were you about to say something, or? Oh, sorry. No, this is helpful. Thank you, Nicole. There's one thing about the sort of the decisions, I was thinking about sort of some of our recent votes. Really, I mean, it's okay that we have a split vote. I think that there's this thought that we should all be, all on the same page. Right. And a lot of times we are, I think we are, but split votes are not something that's going to sort of divide us in some ways. I think we all have the opportunity to vote which way we want, but once we make that decision, it is a unified, right, unified board, yep, decision. So I know I made this statement before, which is like, in some ways you don't necessarily want, every single vote to be 5-0. Mm-hmm. You don't want that. I mean, we do represent the whole community and everything else, and I think it's okay to have split votes. I think it's all right. But once we make that vote, it is the vote of the board. Yeah. So I think we sort of all stick to it. Yeah. So I think that's sort of helpful. The other thing about the comments. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that. I don't know if anyone else has gotten Slack, but I've gotten emails and sort of comments about, mm-hmm, sometimes we have negative comments, directed to either one of us or Dr. Roses or staff, mm-hmm, members, and because it's during public comment, we just basically have to sit there and take it, which is what it is, what we have to do. But we also have like a regular board policy that actually says, I mean, it is freedom of speech, that people, mm-hmm, can go ahead and comment and critique all they want. So the reality of it is that, people can get up and say whatever they want. It is completely their right, and we allow them to have space to do it. Yeah. And so I don't think, and we have a board policy that allows for basically, yeah, the critiquing of district staff and employees. So yeah, I know that we've gotten comments about saying, well, why don't you stop this, or why don't you do this? And I said, well, one is not like a community meeting where it's back and forth. This is the public's time to sort of provide their comment, and they can basically say what they want. So I know we've gotten comments about that, but I just, there's a platform, there's a reason why we have, right, that, and we just have to, in some ways, just take it. So, because that's, yeah, public's right. So.
Yeah, Ken, and thank you for pulling that one out. I think there's a lot of boards struggling with this. I want to say it is not just you. Do not feel alone in this. It's very normal. You signed up for this role, right? And so when you sign up for leadership roles, right, you kind of sign up for taking heat, right? Because you have power. And so I want to speak to that, right? When we talk about the role of power. And so, yes, people can speak in their public comments. I think what I always like to help boards understand is the tone and the culture that you're establishing as a board, right? The communication, the relationships you have with your community. It's always something to reflect on, right? Like, how do we create a space that is, remember, I go back to that safe space, right? So how you establish that and model that obviously is one piece, but then what people do, it is their prerogative. They do what they want. Here's my thing that I want you all to consider is pre-COVID, because I want you to go back to pre-COVID, right? A lot of this is right now because we're in virtual space. So you have more opportunities for people to more easily engage. But when you think about if someone speaks their truth and you don't agree with it, or maybe you don't understand it, you know, what we used to do in person, right, is there were opportunities for us to say, you know, thank you for your comments, you know, I'll follow up with you, or let's get their information, we'll follow up so we can learn more. What's happened is there's been kind of this division, right, because we're not with each other anymore. We don't see each other. We can't do coffee with our community like we used to. These are relationships that have been tarnished. So I want you all not to be too much stuck in just the virtual world, but I do want you to be mindful because the community is hurting. You are the sounding board, right? You're the sounding board. You may not always understand, but you're the sounding board. And as a board, your job is to serve all community members, right? It's not about one area, one school, it is everyone. So when you have moments in time where you have I call them the hot topics, that's where you hear people kind of speaking their truth and they're really sharing because it's something that's passionate to them and it's impacting their kids. We want to think about, are those the ones where maybe we need to pause and think like we might need a special opportunity just to hear these voices because there's a lot of people saying the same thing, right? Which becomes, again, go back to now just the logistics of your board meeting. You have board meetings that last till 1 a.m. is what people are having right now. And so that's where, you know, what is the role of community listening sessions where you can have more of an opportunity for interaction? It's designed around listening and having a dialogue versus board meeting structures are not designed for that. So community doesn't understand that, right? They just know that this is a place I can be heard. So then when I get offended because I said something, you didn't respond, you didn't react, you just ignored me. That's what it feels like, but that's because our community only has that platform. So how do we think about the use of community listening sessions that are more ongoing so that it's not so much they just wait for the board meeting to share and then there's no way to have a response or a statement? But then also, how do we think about, are there individual or group stakeholders that we need to meet with like you used to do, right? I mean, I hate saying that, but you used to do that, which made the culture of this work very different. So I want to speak to that because I often say the ones who are the pushing back the most, we got to lean in the most in here because maybe they need to understand more about what go back to your values, what your values are, right? So I want to just speak to that because that's been hard for boards right now. And I want to acknowledge how, you know, you're people too. So when you get attacked by people, that doesn't feel good because sometimes they might not hear or they might not recognize like who you are as a person and where you're coming from. But the reality is that once you hit that gavel, right, it's 5 of us, we have our superintendent, and now we're in business mode and we don't personalize it. But we do have to have effective ways to respond because our community, even down to our body language, and I just want to call that out. I've watched many board meetings, just lots of board meetings beyond yours. And one of the things that happens is even our body language, right? People are speaking, we're not looking, we're not even in the present. So, you know, this virtual space kind of creates this oddness, right? Sometimes we're like looking down. I mean, little things create a culture where people feel like we're not engaging with them. So it's just those things that we have to just recognize is hard right now, but we want to continue to create a culture where we are inclusive, because that's what you said your values were on the page before, right? And that's a tough one. So when we get to this next piece in our protocol, I do want to speak to where this can fold into your agenda building, okay? Because I think also there's a way to really help support the structures of meetings so that it's more effective and impactful, and kind of a win-win for the community and for you, because you got business to handle. So I just want to, you know, say, I understand it, but public comment has created a space where it's really awkward right now. And, you know, to be fair, you know, COVID-19 has done a number on all communities. So it's, you know, as the power structures, it falls in your lap and it's not fair. No, who signed up to lead a district during a pandemic? It's unprecedented. So it's part of the work. You just have to chalk it up to when people are hollering and screaming. It's not personal, but we do need to respond effectively. And I think that's what's important. And communication is going to be important. Ongoing communication, key talking points, and making sure that the community is clear And it is okay to respond, right? It's just how you respond, when you respond, making sure the community understands that protocol is what's going to make a difference. Okay, so that they don't feel ignored, but they also recognize sometimes I'm not going to have an answer for the nastiness that comes across, the dais to us. That sometimes there's not going to be a response to things that are going to be harmful and unhealthy as well. So I know we're kind of in the protocol, so I want to make sure let's, because we're going to run out of time. And so I feel like the norms for your working norms, you feel like those are pretty good. I have that language. I think Joan was taking notes so we can collaborate before we send it back to the board. If that's okay. Let's skip real quick to page 4, because you also have discussion norms. So I just want to make sure we can include these, because you all added these around keeping the focus on the best interests of students, which was kind of your top norm earlier, assuming positive intent, being willing to push each other's thinking. So this is more about how you all discuss, looking at every issue with multiple perspectives, inviting and welcoming the contributions of every member, and to listen to each other, listen to understand, agree to disagree, be solutions oriented, and support the team's decision. So a lot of that you kind of covered in your norms, but this is also really important to think about how these look in terms of your actual discussion with each other, especially when you talked about making decisions and you all don't vote the same, right? Even before voting, I encourage boards, if you don't feel like you have a good understanding of what you're voting on, it's okay to table things and go back to discuss them, right? That's a protocol, right? That's a norm, is you can discuss so you can have better understanding. But yes, it's okay also, like you said, let's support the team's decision in the end. So thoughts about discussion norms. You feel like these are working? Are there things that we need to adjust before we jump into our protocols? Feel like norms, discussion norms, we should keep them the same?
I'm okay with these. I think that,
Okay.
Just based on the discussion, it is because we get a lot of people who do attend our meetings like for the very first time, they don't understand. And it does, that this is like the only time that we get to actually deliver.
Right. There you go. Yep.
So sometimes it looks like, well, why didn't we think about this before? Why didn't we talk to each other about this or something like
There you
that?
go.
But
yes.
I think that I guess it's important to remind, all of us, that it is, it's okay that we look like we have pauses, that we are thinking about things.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that, and plus because of Zoom, like we can't all tell when we're all about to start talking.
Absolutely.
Before when we're in the boardroom, you can kind of look at each other and there could be kind of a signal.
Yeah.
But here it's a little bit more difficult. So
yeah.
I think it's okay to have these pauses and then also to remind people that, this is the only time that we can actually jointly talk. So I'm not saying that there's something to be added there. I'm just saying that it's an important piece to point out because I know that we've gotten emails about that too, where people think that, why does it look like we're not prepared or something like that?
Right,
but,
right. Yeah.
Partly because we can't talk to each other outside most of the time.
Good point. So, good point. Questions, thoughts about your discussion norms? And again, this is really speaking about how you interact with each other in your actual discussions when you before you make a decision, right? This is how it looks. So you feel like these are still good? All right, we don't need to add anything. Okay, my only thing I would push you to do is just make sure you make the community aware of these are your norms, right? So that they understand what's happening. Sometimes it's just good to when you adopt your handbook, besides just adopt it, like actually speak to it so they understand this is how we operate. All right, so I'm going to go very quickly through the roles. I want to get really to the protocol, but on page 5 through page, I believe it was 9, you have your roles and responsibilities that you carved out. I know I spoke to it in that slide and said, with the looks like the little clock and you have the dotted blue line, but I just want you to take a few moments, just look through each bullet point around responsibilities of the board, which I know you kind of adopted from the CSBA guidelines, and then responsibilities and roles of the superintendent. So I'm not going to go line by line, but I want you to just pause for a second, okay? just for a few moments. I want you to look through page 5 through 9 and see if anything sticks out to you that you feel needs to be changed. I feel like you have your structure already in place, and some of these are kind of basic guidelines, so I don't think there's a lot you need to change, but is there anything that sticks out? So I'm going to give you a few moments, page 5 through 9, your roles and responsibilities, and then we're going to end with our protocols. So I want to take a second, just see if anyone wants to jump in. Anything that you feel based on roles and responsibilities may need to be changed, or if you have a question about what you have already listed. Roles and responsibilities. No, none can. Lisa, anything from you? No, you're still absorbing it all. Joan, jump in.
So Nicole, the new superintendent will come in July
Yep.
1. And I know that that person will probably want to review what the
Yep.
superintendent needs
Yep.
From the board, because every superintendent is different in what they expect. Will you, once I know that there was some talk that the search firm would do a bridging. Would you go back to this at that time so that they have a chance?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great part of when we do the performance objectives and goals, right? It's always like good to just revisit. So this whole handbook will really come back up again, because if remember, go back to, like we said, like it's your own culture you create with your superintendent and your board. So there are some things that would naturally change. So absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they may have certain needs. So
they sure will. Yep.
Thank
you. Yeah. And I think in the protocols, we'll kind of see that in a second, which is where I want to have you chime in for a couple of things that may overlap with the next superintendent too. So any thoughts, questions about the roles? Do y'all feel comfortable with leaving them as is? And obviously knowing that with the new superintendent, some of these may adjust a little bit, but the core of it, I think, is solid. So I don't want to, have you feel like there's a lot you need to change, but your new superintendent will, probably have some adjustment just based on their leadership style. What works well for them. So do y'all feel comfortable with leaving your roles and responsibilities? Okay. All right. Okay, and so one thing I do want to do is always remember that, again, this is a living document. So as you're continuously going through your work during the year, go back to this. What is my role? Sometimes when you have those little moments of friction, what is our role? What do we agree to? Right, very important piece of the work. Okay, sometimes we get lost in those because of just the nuance of everything that's going on. So this is always a great document to go back to. What is my role? What is the superintendent role? Let's make sure we discuss it. If there's any conflict, something's not working well, let's talk about it, right? Very, very simple, but y'all have your guideline here. Okay, so the last piece I wanted to go to, and I want to actually give Joan an opportunity to speak a little bit about one nuance, kind of one of a technical kind of logistical issue around not only the minutes, but also board agenda building. I think it's important to just give a little bit of time for that. But this last section that I wanted to pull out for you is the protocols, right? And so just looking at the way you all have listed it is kind of like what the issue is and then what's the agreement, right? So you have board meetings, you have the role of the president, you have public comments. So a lot of these things we just talked about. But as you look at each of these sections, I want you to think about what might be missing in these bullet points, okay, around your protocols, around how you actually not only interact with each other, but what does this look like in action, okay? And so as we get ready to go into this, I want to just take a moment for the sake of time to talk about a couple things. So one, I know board meeting minutes is a process that falls into, I'm going to jump to page number 13 around communication, right, with the community. And so, and I may have missed, where was my other spot that I had for meeting minutes, but how we utilize meeting minutes to communicate, but not just using them to communicate because this is a public forum, but also like how you're collecting the meeting minutes, right? And what is useful in terms of like every board's a little different in how they collect minutes. So Joan, I want to jump in, just have you just speak a little bit about one protocol around communication, obviously what happens at the board meetings afterwards is our meeting minutes. So if you want to jump in for a moment, we can see what the board kind of thinks about it.
Different boards under during my tenure have had different desires related to minutes. So there have been times when just the gist of the conversation has been captured, and then of course, if there's any action, of course. But then we move to having more detailed minutes, really trying to capture more of what was said. And now we have board videos, which are posted, and we're writing the very in-depth minutes. Now, these minutes at this point in time are taking a tremendous amount of staff effort, which means that the staff are not doing other things that need to be done. So I was wondering, where are we now with our desire for minutes? You have a video. Do you want to go back to having just the gist of the conversation captured, maybe the speaker's names and then the actions? Or do you appreciate reading the minute summaries that are done? I need more direction on what you are really using and think is appropriate for our community.
Good question.
I personally think, they're recorded now. And so to me, it doesn't feel like it's a good use of staff time to be writing everything that people can watch. And I mean, it's not something I utilize ever, right? Like in real time. So there's no need for it. I feel like, to me, it makes sense to have kind of the bare minimum that would need to kind of, so people could kind of follow, maybe including like times when people could find that in the video, like this is the time frame. I don't know how much time that would take, right? Again, like I'm cognizant of how much time it's taking and the fact that like I'm doubtful anybody's reading them in their entirety. So it just, to me, doesn't, like, there are more important things for staff to be focusing on, in my opinion. Something else I just wanted to throw out there about, and I don't know if it's appropriate time, but I'm just going to say it because we have 10 minutes left, so I brought this up with Joan the other day because I was on a call with some board members from all over the country, and I was sharing about our public comments and the length of our public comments and the length of our meetings. And they were like floored. Like they were like, we've never had public comment go that long. We've never had meetings go that late. And we spent a lot of time talking about, like, honestly, the inequities that sets up in terms of accessibility to people participating on a board when, like, you have to go to work the next day. Or like, selfishly thinking a little bit about myself, like when you have really little kids, like staying up until 2 a.m. just really, it's very, very hard to make it work. And if we want to attract a diverse board, I think it's important to take into consideration. I asked Joan about it. She reached out to legal counsel, and we actually do have a board policy that states that public comment per agenda item is limited to 20 minutes. This is not to say that I do not value public comment. I do not think that the public's opinion is important. I do feel like we have to weigh pros and cons of like how much public comment we can take per agenda item. And I do think it's worth revisiting that and reminding ourselves in our community that that is the limit per agenda item. And the board president then would have discretion to extend it, say, to 30 minutes, right? And then to let people know that they're welcome to email us with their concerns, if they're not able to make a public comment at that time. But I do think it's something to take into consideration. And I'd be interested to know what other people think about it. But I think it's an unsustainable way to continue moving through our board meetings. I know for me it is, and I would anticipate for other people it probably is. And I think for our community it is, right? Like to wait until 12 to get to an agenda item that you actually really want to be a part of, but you can't because we've had 4 hours of public comment prior. So that's just something else I wanted to throw out there, which I know was not the original question, but kind of is encompassed.
It's perfect. It's amongst it's protocol around communication with your community. So I think it easily fits in there. So y'all jump in.
Yeah, no, sure. I'm glad you brought that up because we also, I mean, one of the other notes that I had in preparation for today's meeting as well is what I mentioned before. Sometimes we also have a board policy that we have a time check, that actually is codified in that we do a time check at 9:30, and that we go ahead and say, all right, we also are supposed to try and keep our meetings 3 to maybe 4 hours max. So obviously the COVID things have sort of really messed things up. But I am cognizant of that too. And I don't necessarily know if we want to, I mean, we can try it and say, let's go ahead and go to our board policy and be like, 20 minutes per item. I mean, we could do that. It definitely would, it would be tough on the public comment at the moment, but I agree. I think that there is at the moment in terms of the length of our meetings it's really tough. I also think that, I mentioned to Joan that, because we have so many items and reopening has taken us such a big toll, one of the other thoughts is maybe we need to go back to having, meetings once a week again, like we had in the summer, so we can get some of the other stuff done. And therefore our meetings are really, are 3-4 hours because they're just, they're more frequent, but just short. So I'm open to how you guys want to proceed with public comment. I think that there's going to be pushback if we limit it, but I do know that it is an issue. Like we can't, the most important part about, not the most important part, but people want to hear our deliberations and want to hear what our decisions are. And, it's tough when we have to make a decision at 1:30 in the morning and we are really not fully functioning and not thinking right. So I think that there is a point to that.
Can I ask a quick question, Ken? How do you all use your written comment protocol? Is it only verbal and any submissions in writing? Like, how are you using that as a board?
Public comment during meetings are all just verbal. I know that there's other jurisdictions that actually go through and read the written stuff into the record, but we don't do that.
Okay.
So it's really just verbal.
Yep, got it.
One quick thought, and then I'll stop talking. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Noelia. I already talked. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add real quick. I think that something that has been pretty clear from our community is that I don't think they necessarily want to be giving public comment during our board meetings. They want to be heard, right? And that's how, the need for more coffee chats came out. And like, I know that I committed to doing a coffee chat or some type of, listening session with folks, with the community. And I think like maybe if we as a board can commit to like once a month, an hour, like an hour or two, I think there are other ways to fill that need in the community and still, have it be, yeah. You get what I'm saying? Sorry.
Perfect. Good stuff.
I was just going to share really quick that I think that that's a great idea, and I think that I think there may be pushback, but I also think this is where like communication and like the why is really important. And I also think there are creative ways, right? Like one thing I'm thinking about is if we're really clear with our community that like we're instituting a policy that's already been there, right? As a result of X, Y, or Z, that we really value community input and potentially changing the process a little bit, right? Like is there a way for people to buy, Thursday morning at 10, submit submit things in email to the board and to, Dr. Rosas and Anna, for example. And then there's like some sort of, and Dr. Rosas, you can let me know how like this may or may not be okay with, for staff, but like I'm thinking about transitioning like the minutes to some sort of like brief synthesis of public comments that have gotten that can be presented to the board or something at the beginning, right? Like these are some of the gist of some of the public comments that we've gotten, and that we all commit to reading them and the board president commits to responding to all of them or something like that, right? So I don't know, I think that there are other ways that we can think about process outside of just like the public comment piece.
Yes. Can I also, you know, think, because I'm taking notes, and I know Joan is as well, because there's all your protocols, there's lots of different places where you're addressing these. I want to just, you know, make sure we speak to the agenda building piece, because I think that also impacts how this public comment looks, right? Like they make comments about the agenda items. And so I think I heard you say, Shar, like maybe we just rethink how often we meet. You know, we have less agenda items on a meeting versus having so many, and obviously reopen has taken, you know, a little bit more. But the agenda building protocol, can you just speak to that for a moment, just to make sure that that's really clear, so that everyone is clear about what goes on the agenda, right? Because sometimes there's like, hey, I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about, like, let's just make sure we have that clear for the handbook piece before we end.
So there are agenda items that have to be done at certain times of the year, for example.
Yep.
So those are listed out on a year-long calendar that we manage. Then there are items that are added throughout the year because of initiatives or things that have come up. And so those are then added. Now, we had, I think this is an area that we really need to focus on, particularly as a new superintendent comes on board.
Right.
And we've had a lot of transition, and so
Yep.
this has changed over time. But I really think that probably we need to establish a board agenda builder that's pretty robust for the year. So that people can see the items. And Ken has committed to sitting down during spring break to looking at the next 6 months, so that we get particularly through the rest of this year and then into the new superintendent's year. But then another question is, how do items show up on the calendar? Like, how do you all want to inform your president that you would like those placed on the agenda, so that we can still manage a reasonable agenda? Now, I want to just go back to one thing. Before all the reopening and the COVID, we were actually had about the right amount of agenda items to get us through in our period of time that we were hoping to get our items through. But then when we started adding the reopening, that went out the window. So I think that once we're back to school, it will be more normal, and we'll be back to a more normal amount of time. But I did want to know more about how to place items on the agenda builder.
Yeah. And can I speak to one thing, Joan, as the board considers that? And I know we need to close out because you all are at your time. But remember the conversation about your 4 priorities that I've been pushing you to think about as a board? Part of your agenda building really should always be centered around what are our priorities, right? And I think that's going to help you when you build your agendas around, like, you know, as an individual board member, you may say, hey, you know, Ken, we want to put this on the agenda. But you got to make sure it's aligned with your priorities, so that you all aren't all over the place talking about everything that may just not be what needs to be in the board's kind of, you know, view at that moment. So I think priorities is always important as you think about how do we get these items on the agenda, considering initiatives, right? Because you had a lot of initiatives, you all. I want to remind you, you have a lot of initiatives, you have a lot going on. But how do you prioritize too? And I want to just throw that in too.
And I'll go back to Noelia. When she was president, she created a board agenda builder that basically did delineate the areas that we were really going to focus on, in particular teaching and learning being the key.
Yeah, good.
So we have really spent the majority on that.
I want to give Shar credit for that because it wasn't me.
Okay, so it's during Noelia's period of time that Shar and she must have found it, but whatever, it's the one we're still using. So we do have that delineated, but it is so if something comes up, then how does it end up on the agenda builder? How do I know that that's an important point for all of you? And because what's been happening is it says board requests for future agenda items. And so one person will say they want something. I'm not sure really if everyone is, and then
Right.
what staff to assign it to, and how big is this project going to become.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to, for the future, managing expectations around work.
Good point.
So I know this came up. So during the CSBA, I attended CSBA conference. I attended the future prep board presidents workshop, and this came up in one of our small groups. And the issue was, how do items get specifically on? And in our small groups that represented 6 different other school districts in California, I thought it was sort of just standard. This is how we do it and everything, and this is how it goes. But it's surprising how wide and diverse this actually putting something on the agenda is. When we were all in the boardroom, it was pretty clear that when someone says, oh, hey, I want something on the agenda, I think we'd all look, and I think Joan looks at everybody and says, when you see like a majority of people nodding their heads, it was like, okay, let's go ahead and do that. We don't necessarily have that opportunity. I think most times we're all visible, but sometimes you don't necessarily have that opportunity. But our policy right now is that it's one board member can request something to be put on. And I think that's still the protocol. I don't know if we want to change that. The one thing that I think that that's important to note is that items that be put on our agenda really should be going back towards sort of like our mission and values,
Right.
and sort of our, why we're actually here, at the board.
Good point.
There was one school district, I forget who it was, but they were further south than us. They actually had some sort of process where if you had to put it on, if you were making a request to put something on the agenda, you had to actually go back to the mission statement or the vision statement, and say, this is why it relates to what we're doing.
Yep.
And so therefore, and then there was a relevant reason to put it on. Versus someone else. And I heard all these stories about some people asking for like, let's change the sky to red or something else like that, something like crazy.
Right.
And because one person asked for it, technically it had to go on.
Right.
But it wasn't related to what the actual work was.
There you go.
So to me, I kind of feel like I'm okay with the way that, it is right now in terms of our policy. Just as long as we all remember that, it has to be reflective of what we're actually doing. And I think for the most part we are. So I'm okay with how it is, but I don't know if anybody else has any other comments about it.
I agree. I think that I worry about moving to something like a majority, right? Because then you end up potentially silencing like divergent voices, right? So that sort of thing really makes me uncomfortable. But I think just even requiring or requesting that we have the justification, when we're requesting it, and then trusting that the board president and superintendent are kind of, taking that into consideration and adding. And then I have in my mind this vision for what this could look like. So I can send it, Ken and Joan, to you if I can get my life together enough to do that. Because I feel like I really, I don't know. I feel like these kind of systems and structures, I really enjoy them. You guys said
it's really important. It's really important, and I'd like to see it because we've changed over time. I mean, we've tried different things. So I think that we need to change again because we need to get something really tight that'll be easy for a person who's coming in brand new because they have a lot of work they're going to need to do just on establishing relationships and knowing what the community needs, not just worrying about what the next board agenda is. So I'd like to get this really tight for folks. But it does feel like there might need to be, I mean, we're past time for today, but it feels like there needs to be more conversation about public comment, communication patterns, and then including this board agenda builder. So I don't know, Nicole, if you are hearing that also, and maybe can come back at another time to work further with the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ongoing. You know, when I go back to the 4 agreements, the non-closure, right? When we end these, there's never a stop point, right? There's never a it's done, because you're growing, you're learning together. And remember, you're focused on equity. And that in itself creates a sense of non-closure, because there's so many new things that come out of this. When we say something like building an agenda, right, with an equity lens, requires a different way of doing business, which we have to get used to. So it's going to take time. And so I think, if as long as you all are open to, we're going to adjust, and our adjustment is, let's just go back over our handbook and we just go and follow what we said we were going to do. That in itself is going to get you into a place of effective governance, right? That's going to then eventually now impact what you want to do, which is close equity gaps, right? And when you close equity gaps, you actually impact all kids, right? That's the great part about this work. So I think, Joan, to answer your question, I think that, of course, we're obviously, I'm, honored to be a part of, supporting your superintendent search in itself. And I know that you're gonna have to revisit this again with your new superintendent. So part of me is like, don't get too down into the weeds, because you may need to adjust again, but your basic structure, I think, is solid. I want to say that I think it's solid. I think that I commend you on going through your handbook with an intentional lens, right? I've done this with boards where it was just a check mark. We're just doing this because we got to get it done and get it on the agenda to check. We got to get that done. But I see you all really internalizing this and really seeing this as this is how we are going to do our work together. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. And I'm super excited for you. I'm excited for you and want to commend you in front of your community, that it takes a lot to do this work publicly, and to be, in a space of learning together, and to be vulnerable, to say that we're growing, we're learning, we want to do the right thing. We want to make those tough, bold decisions, as mentioned earlier. But in the end, you all are in a place where your structure is going to make a difference when we talk about really going deep into equity work. So I'm just excited for you on your journey, and just appreciate, what you've put into today for these just few hours of work. So Ken, jump right in.
Sorry, I know one of our 4 pillars, or not 4 pillars, but our things are accepting non-closure.
Oh,
but there's just a couple, there's just 2 things that I wanted to bring up that I think that would be important to have some closure on. This is that because I do think that, this governance handbook stuff is really important, because this sets up how we talk about and how we function throughout the year. One thing that I wanted to bring up, and I know this would add time, but SMFCSD did request the opportunity to provide some sort of additional public comment, because they felt like their public comment time was really rough or shortened by the 3 minutes that we normally give them. I did talk to Joan, and there was a recommendation to look at the Samtown Unified to see how they do it and see whether we can replicate it. And per Joan, I'm just going to summarize, is that basically during our committee and our foundation reports, they actually have a section in there for, labor union comments as well,
Updates.
or reports, updates. So I just wanted to get sort of consensus from the board whether or not that's okay for us to start doing, because I think it would be really good for to sort of respond to the requests from our unions. So how it would function is basically just like during our committee reports, we just have a line item as well that just says, union updates or reports. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that?
Yeah, I apologize. I made an assumption you already were doing that. And so absolutely, I think that's a great practice, but with clarity.
Yeah, no, there's a number of things that we have been brought up over the year that this is the time, unfortunately, that we had to talk about it. So, but I don't know if that's okay with everybody. Sorry.
I think they need to have a voice, and they need to be heard. I also think CSCA needs to be heard as well. I know that we speak a lot about SMFCSD, and
it would be for both.
Yeah, both.
It's an opportunity for both.
We couldn't have a district without our teachers, beyond a doubt, but we also can't have a district without our classified staff as well.
And you have a representative group of administrators.
Yeah.
So it would be just a line item for CSCA, SMFCSD, and SMEA.
Yeah. If they want. just like our committee updates is they have an opportunity. So the second thing is just sort of the return to the boardroom. I know that we have the issues with COVID. Joan, I know you sent an email out about that. But I do feel like we do need to go back in some way. We might have to pilot it. You know,
So Peter was in the boardroom the other day, figuring out how to get the cameras up and running and potentially having each of us on a computer so that we could continue to Zoom, because we can't bring the people into the boardroom, but we can be in the boardroom.
Yeah.
So he's working on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I know that if we need to, I mean, I have this setup, which is just my iPad on a tripod, and
Right.
you know, I could essentially bring that into the boardroom and, you know, still function as if I'm here. So I think we need to think about that, because we have asked a lot from our community and our teachers to go back, and, you know, it is something we need to do.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, he was in there this week working on getting us set up
Good to know.
so that we could return also.
Good.
Um,
Yeah, when you all do your soup interviews, just kind of a side item that will be needed too, because you're going to need to open the meetings and then close, and it's public to open it, right? Then you'll close. So yeah, having that, because it will need to be in person too, is important. So good to know try it out now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, try it out.
So the other thing is, are we in some kind of an agreement about looking at the minutes? Should in doing more succinct minutes with maybe the time notation of where you could find the item on the video?
yeah, I'm okay with
Yeah,
action.
Because I'm
Go ahead.
losing a
Yeah.
lot of Anna Almond's time where she could be doing some other things in just doing transcription, basically. Okay.
Yeah, I think that the agenda time and the action
Mm-hmm.
would be good, and like the names of the speakers, maybe
Right.
just like
Okay.
the basics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll go into that kind of a mode and try it out. And if it doesn't seem to satisfy, then we'll change it again.
All right, so I know you all are way over your time, and we definitely want to honor your weekend. You need some rest. I know you're all exhausted, but I just want to thank you for allowing me to hang out with you again, just to continue to just help, facilitate a dialogue and let you reflect and really come up with a foundation, right, for your effective governance practices that will create a legacy and a culture for boards to come in San Mateo Foster City. So I hope you see the work you're doing is so instrumental, not only for now, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, right, you're setting a tone, a foundation, a culture, which is a big deal. So I just want to thank you for allowing me to hang out with you to do that. And thank you, Celia, for interpreting for us with my fast talking. I always forget to pause, but thank you. always. And each of you, Ken and Lisa, Shara, Noelia, Allison, Joan, thank you for your time, your energy, because this is not easy work, and I acknowledge that. So with that, yes, I will collaborate with you, Joan. I'll follow up with my notes, your notes, so we make sure we send back to the board their revisions to their handbook for now, again. And then when the new superintendent comes on, you can revisit that again, and I'll be more than happy to hang out with you to support that. And with that, just my only next steps for you is just to continue to take your equity statement and apply it as a lens to everything you do. That's a huge piece now, is always have that statement. So even at your board meetings, have that printed out right next to you, right? Go back to it. Anything you do, that's your lens. And that's a huge next steps. And then we'll talk about, how with your new superintendent, what that looks like in terms of how to implement, what adjustments need to be made, and how do we start taking that work of the task force and looking at what they're going to suggest to you at the end of this year, how you're now going to use that to drive your work too. So a lot still coming.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Nicole, for facilitating this conversation. Lots of important pieces here that we were able to discuss. So we would collaborate on this and bring it back to the board for your adoption again at probably the March 25th board meeting, and then we can continue to work on different aspects of it.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everybody. So we need a motion for adjournment. Does anyone want to make a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, trustee Watkins. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, trustee Corzo. Roll call vote, trustee Corzo.
Yes.
Trustee Proctor,
Yes.
trustee Warren,
Yes.
and trustee Watkins.
Yes.
And I'll vote yes as well. So we're adjourning at 3:16. Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thank you.